Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Persis Karim, the director of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University and co-director of The Dawn is Too Far. Thank you so much for being here today. Can you please talk a bit about the impetus for making the film? Your background has been in literature, and this is your first film. So what choices did you make in The Dawn is Too Far that you might not make in a book?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. The film was guided by the fundamental principle that I feel has been throughout my career, which is that people need to hear stories about the real lives of Iranians and Iranian Americans through all the noise of the past 45 years, when mostly what people hear or consume by way of news is negative news headlines that have very little to do with people's lives and much more to do with the rhetoric of governments, either the US government or the Iranian government. So I wanted to continue that thread in making a film, but with the idea that film provides a kind of more immediate access to people. You can see their faces, you can hear their expressions, and it can be very unmediated in the way that literature sometimes is mediated through a narrator or is through the written word as opposed to the oral storytelling. So I really wanted to capture something on film that spoke to that. And because I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and because my orientation to Iran and Iranian Americans was through my experiences first as a young person in 1979 during the hostage crisis, and then when I was in college, and then when I returned from graduate school from Texas, I witnessed the evolution of this community in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I thought it was really important to tell how communities are made from immigrant experiences through the ups and downs of larger political and historical events. So I really wanted to capture a long view of Iranians that I had seen in the Bay Area over a longer period of time, and to give them the opportunity to share a bit of their story. I also wanted to work against the narratives, which are now unfortunately quite prevalent in the US, that immigrants take rather than also give a great deal to the societies where they resettle. So I wanted to show the kind of striking beauty and commitment that this community has given to the San Francisco Bay Area, enriched by, of course, what the Bay Area is, by a longer history of political activism and social change, but also bringing the beauty, culture, sensibilities of Iran and its people to people who live here. So that was really the driving force. The choices that you have to make are really different than in literature, because in a way you have to decide whether you're going to provide this larger, narrative voice. And I decided I didn't want to make a film that told the events of the last 45 years or 50 years, but rather gave the strength of people's own stories front and center to this. And the hardest part was condensing it into a 55-minute film, because we filmed more people than were present in the film, but also deciding what story arc or what larger narratives we wanted to emphasize. So of course I knew I wanted to emphasize the revolution, but I also wanted to show something before, and of course, what's happened more recently in this country.
You have a lot of really wonderful, striking archival materials in this film. Can you talk a bit about this choice to include the footage from the 1961 film Nowruz that appears at the beginning and end of your film?
Yeah. So that footage, or that film, Nowruz, was commissioned by the San Francisco Consul General, a man named Majid Rahnama, who's now deceased. In the late 50s and early 60s, Iranians were coming to the San Francisco Bay Area and in general to California because California had opened its higher education doors to foreign students. And of course, it coincided with the Shah's imperative to educate young Iranians to help build the modern infrastructure of Iran. So he commissioned this film, and it was made by a woman named Mary Louise Stein, who lived next door to the consulate in San Francisco. And in 2020, when then President Trump ordered the assassination of General Soleimani, this film came into my hands because the son of the filmmaker, Peter Stein, contacted me after he heard an interview that I did on CNN about what the implications of this assassination meant. And also when Trump tweeted that he was going to potentially destroy Iranian historical sites. Of course, Iranians in this country were very anxious and nervous. So that CNN interview prompted Peter to contact me. And he said, I really appreciated the perspective of Iranians who've lived in this country a long time. I grew up next door to the Iranian consulate in San Francisco. We were best of friends with the Rahnama family. And they left after several years, and I have lost track of them. But I wanted to show you this film that my mother made, which has a really rich narrative about Bay Area Iranians. So he showed me the film, and I was like, wow, this is a gold mine. It's only 17 minutes long, but the footage is both about a particular moment in history in the United States when the US and Iran were on good terms, but also about the unique presence of Iranians in the Bay Area. So Peter donated this film to me. I had it restored. I was already working on the film at that point, and I said, I have to find a way to put this film in here because it also represents part of this longer arc of history. So that's how the film came to me. And after I got it restored, I talked to Peter, and he said, I wish I could find these people. I've lost track of them. It's been 60 years. I said, I'll find them for you. So thank goodness for the internet. I went on LinkedIn, Facebook, looked for every potential Rahnama I could find. And he remembered, of course, their first names. So I found Kaveh Rahnama on LinkedIn, and I found Pune Rahnama in Facebook, and they were living in Iran and France, respectively, or Kaveh was living in France. And the three of them, Peter and these two family members, there's another family member from the Rahnama family, actually met online for the first time in 60 years after we showed a restored version of the film. So it was a happy occasion came from this rather messy and ugly event in US-Iran relations, which was a reunion of people who had very fond memories of each other. And last year, Pune Rahnama was in the Bay Area visiting some friends, and Peter and Pune met for the first time in 62 years. And it was a wonderful kind of backstory to this film. And I recently showed the film, and Peter came to the film, and he was so happy to see his mother's film in our film.
Thank you. You spoke a little bit about the tweets and more recent history, the way it's impacted the Iranian American diaspora. and Iranian Americans abroad. Has the film's resonance changed since the recent election, and how?
Well, for me, it definitely has. And I recently showed it, and there was a gentleman in the audience who said it was his second time. And he was like, oh, this film's even more important and relevant than it was 6 months ago. Of course, I think we haven't heard yet very much from Trump about what's next with Iran, but we know essentially Iran is on the radar for, even if it's possible, even more sanctions, but also that it's a target of US foreign policy and has been over the last year and a half with respect to what's happening in the Middle East. But I think for Iranians, the implications are that there's a lot of anxiety about what the anti-immigrant feeling will do to people seeking to come to the US, say for student visas or to visit their families, and the idea that there could be another Trump travel ban, which seems to be kind of the rhetoric of this administration seems to be anti-immigrant, but also anti-particular people, Mexicans, Middle Eastern people. And so I think the film has a certain poignancy because, as you know, the title is The Dawn is Too Far, which is a line of a poem that one of the characters in the film reads or recites. I feel that it represents the kind of tension that Iranians experience in this country and have experienced for the last 45 years. This idea that we can't quite ever let our hair down, so to speak, because there has been always talk of military conflict. There has been a ratcheting up of tensions between the Iranian government and the US government repeatedly over the last 45 years. And of course, that has a psychological impact on people who have families in Iran and who worry about the impact of US policies, for example, around sanctions. I just talked to my cousin whose mother and sister live in Iran, and he was telling me it's impossible to get my mother any kind of medicine for her heart condition. So those stories, I think, are the backdrop for why this film has a renewed resonance, is the idea that Iranians face many challenges over and over because of the fact that they are Iranian and because there is this very messy history between the two countries.
Can you talk a bit about the important work of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies and share with us what its impending closure means for the work you've been doing and for the Iranian diaspora community?
Yeah. Well, I would say that the center's number one mission was to shift some of the emphasis on solely studying Iran as a geographic and historical space to talking about Iran and its longer reach in history through diaspora movement, either in North America, of course, but also in Europe and Asia, and to highlight the ways in which Iranian culture has had a great deal of influence throughout the world over a much longer period of history than this contemporary moment. But I think its fundamental value has been to kind of create a space and a home for people who are Iranian Canadian, Iranian American, that live outside of Iran and don't have access to Iran either because they're not able to travel there, they're not born there, their Persian language is limited, They don't read and write Persian, but they feel the depth of many aspects of Iranian culture, either in the context of poetry, rituals, tradition, food, holidays, and grew up with some connection to Iran, but also feel a form of estrangement and inaccessibility to Iran, the place. So I'm really proud of the work that the center has done to create a space that makes people feel included and seen, whether they're in some ways marginalized because of their religion, their ethnicity, their gender identity, their sexuality, and to highlight the ways in which Iranians don't stop being Iranian just because they don't live in Iran. They continue to evolve and to show others their resilience, their passion, their cultural gifts. And I feel like that is one part of what I have been trying to do in the center's work, both documenting and sharing stories such as the film, but also creating opportunities for people to speak about their individual research with relation to Iranian diaspora communities, say in the US, Canada, Europe, and to look at these histories not as separate, like the history of Iran is separate from the history of North America, but in fact that they're evolving in tandem with each other and they exchange with each other. Unfortunately, the difficulty of traveling to Iran or the difficulty of coming here has created real gaps for people about culture and what the Iranian people stand for or represent. And when there's news headlines, we get a little bit of it, say with the Women Life Freedom Movement, or when a film wins an Oscar. But by and large, there's nothing that American people, for example, can access. More importantly, Iranians don't see themselves in very many spaces represented positively. So part of the imperative of the center is to create both positive and critical representations of Iranians and the work they're doing, but also to just simply represent. You asked about the impending closure of the center, and I will say that I'm, of course, sad and disappointed that the center at San Francisco State will be closing because the donor has decided to support scholarships instead of this center. But I don't think the work of what the center has been doing will stop. I think it will continue in new forms. Of course, having a physical and a institutional representation has been very important. But I also think the exciting news is that there are many younger scholars, including yourself, Neosha, who just finished your PhD working on this very subject of diaspora narratives. So I see the framework very solidly in place to continue this work. And I think as scholars and researchers and teachers, we have to insist on putting that conversation into the work we do, whether it's in a classroom or believing in it, simply believing that this is an important story to be told, should not be erased, it should not be overlooked, and in fact, it should be shared. One of the wonderful things that I'm doing with the University of Toronto is to help build a speaker series, the Iranian Diaspora Lecture Series, under the direction of Dr. Mohammad Tavakkoli, who will make sure that this work will continue and perhaps extend into the work of Toronto and Canada, because of course we know Toronto is a very rich and also understudied space for the Iranian diaspora experience. So I'm very excited about that, and I don't really know exactly what my story is going to be, but I intend to continue to do writing and research, and I hope to share this film for at least the next year in different spaces, because I think it's a conversation starter, and that the conversations need to be had both among Iranians and between Iranians and the societies where they live.
What has been the reception of the film in Iranian diaspora communities and other contexts and communities? And what has been most surprising to you?
I think one of the things that has been absolutely repeated in each screening is how very moved people are by the individuals and the work that they're doing, either in theater, in activism, in presenting cultural forums and stages for Iranian music and arts, and the activism, say, of one of the characters, Parviz Shokat, who's been at a distance trying to impact, the way that Iranians are able to respond to repression and human rights abuses in Iran. So I think people are moved by seeing something that they haven't seen before, i.e., a community that is deeply engaged with its Iranian history and culture. And I think the other part of it is the unique kind of atmosphere of the Bay Area, probably like Toronto, lends itself to surprising experiences and visions. So some of the artists that are featured in the film, I think, really have pushed the needle and the representation of what Iranians are doing in the United States. So I think people have, by and large, been very moved by that, and also sad. There's a certain emotional tension that the film represents about longing and disconnection and overcoming hardship that I think is powerful, and speaks to people's own experience, perhaps maybe giving it voice in ways that people haven't had a lot of time to talk about. One of the most surprising things is that people don't really realize how long Iranians have been in this country. I think the dominant narrative, both in the media and even among Iranians themselves, has been to sort of start the timeline at 1979, rather than recognizing that, like my father, who came in 1946, from Iran, not as a purposeful immigrant, but eventually as an immigrant. Those stories are part of the kind of laying the groundwork for a longer history of Iranian Americans in this particular country, and of course in North America as a whole. And I know there are similar stories probably in Canada as well.